Okay, so let's get right into it. If you've been following the news in Australia, you know it's impossible to avoid hearing about Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party. All of a sudden, a party that many people had, let's be honest, completely written off, is right at the center of a massive political storm. You've got attack ads flying, you've got the major parties scrambling. It's a lot.
But here's where it gets really interesting and kind of confusing. The signals are all over the place. You've got one poll, a news poll, saying their national support actually dropped 3 points, but then a Sky News/YouGov poll comes out showing their support in Queensland has skyrocketed to 27%. That puts them neck and neck with Labour. So what is actually going on here? And that, right there, is the big question we're tackling in this explainer. You know, how did a party that's been dismissed as fringe for decades suddenly become this powerful, game-changing force in politics? Well, the answer, according to the analysis we're digging into, is a story that goes way, way beyond Australia. To really wrap our heads around this, we actually have to zoom out for a second. The analysis we're looking at suggests that what's happening in Australia, well, it isn't some isolated thing. It's part of a much bigger pattern, one that's been playing out across the entire Western world for years now. See, for decades, most Western governments, from Washington to London to Canberra, have been operating on a set of core beliefs, what this analysis calls the Articles of Faith. The thinking went something like this. High levels of immigration were just an unquestionable good. It was seen as an economic necessity to boost GDP and fill job shortages, and a cultural virtue, all under that familiar mantra, diversity is our strength. And this wasn't just a casual policy preference, It became this really rigid, powerful consensus. And as this quote puts it so bluntly, if you dared to question that orthodoxy, you were immediately pushed to the sidelines. You were dismissed as fringe, called emotional, or worse. It basically just shut down any real debate in the mainstream. So what was the result of all that? Well, in Europe and the US, after years and years of this approach, immigration shot right to the top of the list of voter concerns. And that created this huge surge of political energy that, as we all know, ended up fueling movements like Trump, Brexit, and the rise of nationalist parties all across Europe. Okay, so how does this whole global story connect back to Australia? Well, for a long time, Australia was kind of held up as the exception to the rule. But the source material here argues it was never really an exception. It just had a better story, a more compelling narrative. And now, that narrative is starting to come apart at the seams. This slide really lays out that growing disconnect perfectly. The official narrative, the story we were all told, was about this clean, smart, technocratic fix, a points-based system that solved skills shortages. But for a lot of people, the lived reality was something totally different. It was intense pressure on housing, it was strained infrastructure, and just this general feeling that the pace of change was just too much, too fast. And this right here is the absolute key. It was in that gap, that growing space between the official story and what people were actually experiencing every day, that a party like One Nation found its political oxygen and really started to get a foothold. So you might be wondering, if this tension was building and building, where were the major parties in all this? Well, according to this analysis, what they did, or more accurately what they didn't do, is a huge part of the story. It basically created a massive political vacuum. For years, it turns out both Labour and the Coalition were pretty much running from the same playbook. Sure, their language was a little different. Labour might talk more about multiculturalism, the Coalition more about economic management, but the core direction was exactly the same. High immigration is good for economic growth. Period. And that left voters who were feeling the squeeze with no real alternative in mainstream politics. The analysis is particularly sharp when it comes to the Coalition. The argument is that they talked about borders, but governed on volume. What does that mean? It means that while all the stop the boats rhetoric was grabbing headlines, behind the scenes, the actual number of migrants coming into the country kept going up steadily and significantly. So, and this is the crucial takeaway here, this whole approach didn't fix the underlying tension. It actually did the opposite. It locked it in. By basically refusing to have a real debate or offer any alternative, the major parties created this political space that is now, as the analysis says, wide open for a party that's willing to tap into what a lot of voters are feeling. So, all of this leads us to the million-dollar question. What happens now? Where does all of this go? The analysis lays out 3 really interesting potential paths forward, not just for One Nation, but for all of Australian politics. All right, let's break these down. First up, you have containment. This is the scenario where migration numbers slow down and the pressure on things like housing and infrastructure eases up. If that happens, one nation stays influential, for sure, but their support is contained. Next, there's absorption. This is where the coalition basically shifts to the right and adopts some of one nation's ideas. In that case, one nation kind of wins the argument, even if they don't win a lot more seats. And finally, you've got breakthrough. This is the big one. If the pressure from housing and migration just keeps building, the party's support could push well into the double digits, which would cause a massive fragmentation of the political right. So, after looking at the global picture, the Australian story, and what might happen next, what's the final takeaway? What does this all boil down to? Well, it's about a reckoning that has been a long, long time coming. And this really gets right to the heart of it. This whole thing, it isn't really about one party or one politician. It's about something much more fundamental, the real-world impacts of large-scale migration. It's an issue that the political establishment just ignored for too long, and now it's forcing its way right back to the center of the conversation. And that brings us to this really powerful way of looking at the party's history. The real story here isn't that one nation somehow survived against all odds. No, the story is that it waited. It waited for the reality on the ground to finally catch up with the very reason the party existed in the first place. Which leaves us with this final, thought-provoking question. Everything we've talked about, the confusing polls, the political drama, it's all just a symptom. The real question is this. What happens to a country when a fundamental issue, an issue that's been ignored for decades, simply cannot be ignored any longer?